Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next class. Corey, we are ready for the housekeeping items.
Fantastic. Welcome to the Family History Library's celebration of National DNA Day. DNA Day is actually yesterday, but we're celebrating today. Our next class is titled Using DNA to Determine Relationships, presented by Beth Taylor. This
Corey,
class...
I'm not hearing you.
Oh.
I can hear her.
Oh, must be. Can everybody else hear me?
I can now, sorry.
Okay, good. We're so glad you could join us. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. This class is being live streamed. You will be able to review a recording of this class on the Family History Library Facebook page for a limited time and later in the DNA Basics Learning Center from rootstech.org. We will be answering questions at the end of this presentation, so please post your questions in the chat or comments. If you are on Zoom and would like to have your questions and comments seen by everyone, please make sure your chat messages are set to panelists and attendees. If you have a specific research problem, whether or not it relates to DNA, we encourage you to sign up to meet one-on-one with one of our research specialists in a virtual genealogy consultation. Go to the Family History Library's website or search Virtual Genealogy Consultations on the FamilySearch Wiki. We want to remind you that there is a lot of great content about DNA available from rootstech.org, especially in the DNA Basics Learning Center. To access the DNA Basics Learning Center, go to rootstech.org, click Expo Hall on the top right, and then scroll down to the bottom of the page to the section titled Featured Booths. Let me introduce our presenter for this class, Beth Taylor. She's amazing. Beth works as a United States and Canada research specialist at the Family History Library. She holds a bachelor's degree in history from Brigham Young University and has worked for FamilySearch for 15 years. Her specialties and interests include Quakers, DNA, land records, probate records, organizing, and more. So we'll turn the time over to you, Beth.
Thanks, Corey. So welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you got a chance to listen to Johnny Pearl and talk with Wendy and Edgar from FamilySearch during our lunch break. It was fun to hear him talk about the awesome tools. We're going to highlight a couple of the things that DNA Painter has to offer as we work through this class today. So before our lunch break, we went through a class on grouping DNA matches, how to cluster, and this is kind of a class that goes hand in hand with that. So this is also a process-focused class. One of the things, though, as I was reminded as I listened to that conversation during our lunchtime, it's just that as you do DNA, that you do want to take a step back and stop and think, why are you doing DNA? What's your goal? Just as if you're doing research, what we call traditional paper trail research, you have to start with a research goal. If you don't start with a research goal, you're kind of unfocused. You don't really know what you want. You don't know what you're looking for. So make sure that you have a sense of what is it that you want to do with your DNA. Now, it's possible that you just kind of want to explore what does it have to offer. That's great. Then focus on that. But it's possible that you have a brick wall in your family and that's what you want to focus on. So kind of approach your DNA work the same way, because DNA is part of the research process. It goes hand in hand. It's a record, just like everything else, just a different type of record, and we work with it slightly differently. But you still have to have that sense of what's the overall goal that the DNA is going to help you solve. So just make sure that you're thinking about that as we kind of work through this next class. So just kind of a quick overview. You have ancestors, your ancestors passed on DNA, and you are a sum total. Well, not a sum total, but you have some DNA from most of your ancestors. So DNA is valuable when it's inherited, and then also it's valuable when we compare it. We are going to focus a lot on that comparison aspect of working with DNA and your DNA matches. Again, like with the cluster class, we are focusing on autosomal DNA tests, and we are focusing on the match list option, what you get, that list of people with whom you share DNA, because that's really where you find the most solutions to problems. That's where you will work a lot of your time. So you kind of want to understand the processes, but it's kind of comes back to this idea. It's inherited, it's compared, we're doing autosomal, and we're working with our matches. So as I mentioned in our last class, there's two kind of big key DNA processes. They go hand in hand. You kind of go back and forth between the two of them. We have clustering and determining relationships. So we went through clustering in the first class when we talked about grouping DNA matches. And then in this class now, we're going to talk more about how do you actually figure out the relationship between two people. So again, that's this class. So our objectives, we're going to start by taking a step back from DNA and talk about the difference between half cousins, cousins removed, because understanding these kinds of relationships is actually really important in DNA. If you're not quite sure what a cousin removed is, it's hard to know if the amount of DNA you share with somebody fits within that relationship. So I just want to review it for those who are already comfortable with it, but I do find there's still a lot of people who can't quite figure out why you would remove a cousin, because, you know, they're your cousin, they're a good friend. Why would you want to remove them? So we'll talk about that. We're then going to talk a little bit before you try and figure out how a match is related to you. You might want to spend a few minutes actually evaluating the match, because it's going to help you establish exactly, it's going to give you a sense of how you might be related, so you know where in your tree and what kinds of relationships you're looking for. And then we'll talk about actually that the core piece of this is actually how to take a match and say, okay, based on our trees, and trees could be fallible, but based on our trees, this is our common ancestor. So we're going to kind of go through this process of identifying the most recent common ancestor, the MRCA, and then we'll talk about match clusters, because in the last class, we talked about sometimes creating these unknown clusters. And so what do you do if you have unknown clusters, and since you don't know how you're related to them, how do you do anything with that information? And evaluating those match clusters is a really important part when you are working with, especially with those goals in mind of figuring out an unknown grandfather, an unknown third great grandfather, an unknown father, or a mother, or whoever it is. Figuring out that relationship to how do you work with that cluster is unknown. That's another key piece. Okay, so let's kind of do a quick reminder about removed and half cousins. So again, with DNA, the reason this is important is that when you're a half cousin, you share less DNA, and if you're a removed cousin, anyway. So we need to understand what we mean by all these terms. So there's oftentimes we call somebody a cousin, we call somebody, or a second cousin, or a third cousin, or a fourth cousin, we call somebody a half cousin. You know, a half first cousin, a half second cousin. And it's funny because, you know, before DNA, it kind of felt like, oh, the half doesn't really matter. But once you start looking at DNA, half really does matter, because certainly a half cousin, they share less DNA. And then a cousin removed. This is one I know a lot of people struggle with a little bit. So I just want to walk through what these kind of concepts, what these are. To kind of help us demonstrate this, I just put together a kind of a table where we're seeing some children of a woman named Martha. So here we've got Martha, and she marries a man named John, and she has a bunch of children, or she has two children for sure. We've got William and Grace. And then William has a daughter named Elizabeth, who has a son named Thomas, who has a daughter named Nellie, who has a son named Ryan. And, you know, Grace has, again, descendancy. So that's how we're kind of reading this. And then Martha married a second time and had another set of children, but this time with a man named Frederick. So she also has, she had a daughter named Catherine by Frederick, who had a daughter named Anna, who had a daughter named Christina, had a son named Alexander, who had a daughter named Hannah. So hopefully that's kind of making sense what this chart is telling us. It's a descendancy chart. So when we start to describe relationships, the first thing we have to do is describe how they're related in terms of this first cousin. So hopefully it makes sense that William and Grace are siblings. So their children would be first cousins, their children second cousins, their children third cousins, and so forth. So if we're looking at Thomas and Arthur over on the left, it tells us they're second cousins. John and Martha are their first great grandparents. So second cousins you subtract one, it's the first great grandparents. and they're on the same generational level, meaning they count back 3 times to get to the common ancestor. So Thomas and Arthur are considered just second cousins, and they are considered full cousins. And full cousins, one of the key things, have 2 ancestors in common, because they have John in common and they have Martha in common. Now, what if we're looking at somebody where it's not a full relationship? We're looking at somebody that's a half relationship. Let's take a look at Margaret and Alexander. So Margaret and Alexander, they're in the same generational level from Martha, but they only share one ancestor in common, because they both have Martha in their ancestries, but Margaret has John and Alexander has Frederick. They have different spouses of Martha. So that's when we call them a half cousin, because they only have one common ancestor. So that's the difference between a full cousin and a half cousin, is the number of common ancestors. And then we put the number in front of it based on the number down from that common ancestor. So in this case, Margaret and Alexander are third cousins because they're 4 generations down from Martha, and they're half cousins because they only share Martha but not Frederick and John. Now, how do we describe it when they're not in the same generation apart? Let's take Thomas and Margaret. Now, Thomas and Margaret, now they're full, whatever they are, because they share 2 ancestors in common, John and Martha. But Thomas's first great-grandparents are Margaret's second great-grandparents. So how do we describe this relationship? And this is where removed comes into play. What we do is we look actually at the people that would be on the same level first. So we say that Thomas and Arthur, Margaret's father, Thomas and Arthur would be second cousins. We already established that. But the problem is that Margaret's not in the same generations removed, and that's where the word removed comes from John and Martha. So that means Margaret is 1 generation removed from where Thomas is. So that's why we say that Thomas and Margaret, we go to the closer relationship. Thomas and Arthur are second cousins, and Margaret's 1 generation removed from that. So Thomas and Margaret are second cousins once removed. Again, this is going to become important as we start figuring out DNA relationships, that if you don't understand what these terms mean, then you're going to struggle a little bit trying to determine that relationship based on the DNA. So let's take one that's a little bit more complicated. Now let's pull it all together. We know what cousins are versus full versus half removed. If you had Elizabeth and Alexander, what is their relationship? I want you to just kind of take a minute and think about this. How are Elizabeth and Alexander related? Go ahead and share it if you want to in a chat or in the comments. So we want to think about this. So we want to start with the same generation. So if Elizabeth is in a first generation relationship, she and Anna, who's Alexander's grandmother, are going to be in that first cousin range. But Elizabeth and Anna, how many ancestors in common do they share? They only share 1. So they're half first cousins. And then we count down the number of generations removed from Anna, which is Christina's 1, Alexander's 2. So they are half first cousins twice removed. So hopefully that kind of gives you a better sense of how these halves and everything like that work. So along with that, we just want to point out that we do use some common abbreviations. If you're going to talk about first cousins, we'll just put 1C, half first cousins, 1/2, 1C, and removed, you're going to add in the R. So if you see half first cousins once removed, so 1/2, 1C, 1R, we mean half first cousins once removed. So just to kind of like, when you start seeing these random codes and everything, and people are like, you're my 2C, 3R, and you're like, what does that mean? But it means they think you're second cousins 3 times removed. So kind of just keep in mind when you see those codes, in a way it's, we're coding things just for convenience sake, but sometimes it gets a little confusing. Okay, so then we are going to get to actually determining relationships, which is our end goal. But before we start determining relationships, we want to spend a little bit of time evaluating matches. you take a look at a match, and this might be a match in an unknown cluster. This might be a match that you just barely got that showed up, and you want to figure out how you're related. Well, before you jump in and just look at their tree, and oftentimes they have a tree, you look at it, you solve the problem. That's great. We'll talk about that in a second. But sometimes you need to spend a minute thinking about this match. And sometimes you need to think about this match because I've seen a number of situations where I think the tree is wrong because maybe they linked the DNA to the wrong person. I think I saw one once where they linked the DNA to somebody whose parents were born in the 1700s. So clearly they linked the DNA to the wrong person, and if you can spend some time evaluating the match, you can figure out if that's the case or not. So as you evaluate a match, and here's an example. So this is a real example from my own research, except I did change out the name, so we're using somebody else's name. But the first thing we want to do is pay attention to that name. So when the match has initials, oftentimes that's because the kit is being managed by somebody else. When they only have initials, you can at least use sometimes you can use the kit name, the person managing the kit, to guess what some of those initials mean. So in this case, we have KL and it's managed by John Lewis, then we can guess that that L might stand for Lewis. You can also notice that the little icon on the left is male, is a blue icon, indicating that the person taking the test indicated that they're male. And but think about that. First off, is the surname familiar? Or sometimes you can see a variation of the surname hidden kind of within the name, things like that. Another thing that you can do is click on the kit manager, the person who manages the kit, and find out if you share DNA with the kit manager. And so at least on Ancestry, it'll tell you that. And that's important because it will tell you if the kit manager is a relative, or maybe this was a second cousin to this person who needed them to take a DNA test for one of their projects. And so it kind of just can give you a sense of what's going on, or maybe this is the spouse is the person managing it. But if you do share DNA with the kit manager, that might be the child, and they might have a more full tree. If you go and look at their page, there's some things that might be helpful. See if the kit manager manages other kits. I've seen situations where one person will manage 3 or 4 kits and I don't match them, the kit manager, but I matched all 3 kits. I finally realized it was their 3 children that they had tested, and I must relate to them through their father's side, and the mother is managing the kits. So it gives you a little bit of information about the test taker, because if they're children, then they're definitely not in my generation. That's going to help down the road too. Another thing that you can do, especially, if they have a full tree, this isn't always as helpful. It's not needed. But if they don't have a full tree, or they have an unlinked tree, sometimes you can look at the tree to kind of guess if they are in your generation, meaning about your age, or if they're in a generation older than you or younger than you. Now, why is that important? Well, remember we were talking about the removes. So is this a cousin removed, or is this a cousin? So that will kind of give you a sense. And it's possible, in other situations where you're 30 years apart in age and in the same generation, but you can at least put a guess in there. So for example, if I'm working with my mother's kit, my mother's test, and she's born in the 1940s, and I look at this match, and the match says that the parents of the match were born in 1906 and 1908. Does that mean this person is in my mother's generation? And you kind of have to think, okay, would they be having children around if they were born in 06 and 08? Yeah, they could be having children around the 30s, 40s, 50s. So that would put them probably in my mother's generation, which would make them, in the same generation, no removes. Now, if this is me I'm comparing, and I'm born more in the 1980s, then that's something to also pay attention to, that I'm not in the same generation, and there could be a couple generations in between. Now, another thing that you want to pay attention to is the shared centimorgans. Centimorgan is just a unit of measurement. So in this case, you want to say, okay, what is the probable relationship? Like I said, a centimorgan is a unit of measurement. The more centimorgans you share, the closer the relationship, or and like I said, more centimorgans. Now, ancestry is just going to give you a very general predicted second to third cousin guess on this. And this is where I actually feel like the shared centimorgan project on DNA Painter, for those of you who were able to listen to the conversation or the Facebook Live that FamilySearch did with Johnny Pearl, who runs DNA Painter, he talked about the shared centimorgan project. And this is one of the coolest tools out there, I think. So if you go to DNA Painter and you look at the tools, you're going to come across what's called this shared CM project. So it's put together by a genetic genealogist named Blaine Bettinger, and he actually goes out and he collects data from people, and he says, okay, so you have shown, here's a proven relationship. You've actually demonstrated the relationship, so you know that person was a second cousin. How much DNA do you share? And everybody submitted their data to him. I actually contributed to this last one. He updated this about a year ago. We're on version 4, and then he creates this this kind of resource that shows what those ranges are for all those relationships. And then Johnny Pearl and a couple of other people have then added this interactive element that if I put in the amount of DNA which I shared with that KL, which is 111 centimorgans, then it's going to filter down. It's going to show me two things. One is this probability chart. And Johnny was showing us that if you click on any of these relationships, then you can get what's called a histogram that will tell you what the average and the ranges of all of this. So I put in that 111, and remember, we're thinking if it's me that's compared to this individual, that it's got to be a removed relationship. So I can look at those as saying maybe a second cousin once removed, a half first cousin twice removed, a half second cousin once removed, a second cousin twice removed are my most likely relationships with that 42%, 29%, and anything else is a little bit lower. So that at least gives me a sense, okay, if it's a second cousin, then I'm looking at, second cousin twice removed, I'm probably looking at their great-grandparent level to find the common ancestor or something like that. It can give you like a sense of where to look in their tree to find the common ancestor. And if you're looking in their tree and it's in a very different place, too far back or too close, then you think there's something else going on. In addition to this probability chart up at the top, then at the bottom, what it does is it grays out all of the relationships that can't exist at 111 centimorgans. So it kind of gives you that sense, where ancestry is just saying second to third cousins, which is kind of a generic. This is saying these are all the relationships it could be at 111 centimorgans. It's just a great way of kind of interacting with that number a little bit more than just relying on ancestry. And ancestry is doing a great job. It's just that this is going to give us so much more information, kind of see how many relationships this could be, other than a second to third cousin. Okay, so the other thing that you want to evaluate is if you have started clustering, or if not, then you can look at your shared matches. It will give you at least a sense of which side of the family to focus on. So, thinking about who are the shared matches, if you've already put them in clusters, what clusters do they belong to? In this case, this combination of colors is my mother's line. So I want to start thinking about that line. Well, that's my southern line. That's from the southern United States. We get Tennessee, we get Georgia. So when I look for a common ancestor, that's the line, I'm going to focus on that family. For my family, I'm going to be looking for those names in their tree. So again, just spending a few minutes thinking about the match before you go looking for the common ancestor might give you a sense of what you're looking for. So here's another example. This one's from MyHeritage. So in this case, what do we learn about this match? Well, he's in his 30s. That puts him more in my generation. So we're not looking probably for a removed. What relationships are most likely? He shares 69.3 centimorgans. So I can go look at the shared centimorgan chart and say, okay, these are the relationships. And then I focus on the ones that don't have removes. So that says, okay, we're probably in the same generation. We're maybe about third cousins. And then that gives you kind of a sense. Sometimes MyHeritage will also say, you have these are the common surnames between your tree and their tree. And they'll try and help you out with some suggestions about some relationships. So again, evaluating the match first gives me at least a clue of what I'm looking for as I try and look for the common ancestor. Okay, so then at this point, this is kind of the core thing, which is that you take a match and you try and figure out how are we related, because the way DNA works is all the DNA company can do is say, you are related. The two of you are related because you share DNA. And we can guess that you're about this relationship, but you have to go prove it with something else. There's very, very, very few relationships, I've been trying to think through this, that can be proven by DNA alone. So from here, it comes down to looking at your tree and their tree and seeing if you can figure it out. So what's the process that we're going to follow? So start by choosing a match. And I mean, really, if you're just kind of there to explore your matches, start with the top one and move forward. Now, if you're a little bit more focused, these are the ones, you know, in this unknown cluster, you're going to focus on those in the cluster first, or you have questions on this side of your family, you'll focus there first. And that's the value in doing the clustering, because you kind of, it tells you which matches to pay attention to first. So you choose and evaluate the match and then review their tree. And this is a huge one. We're going to walk through this a few times with different types of trees. And then ideally, you're going to try and find the most recent common ancestor, meaning the person on their tree that also appears on your tree. Now, if you've evaluated your match, you can also say, okay, and they appear in about the right place they should, based on our shared DNA, the amount of DNA we share, and a few other things. From there, you want to actually determine your relationship. So what is your actual relationship? And then you want to record your conclusion in some format. This is, I kind of think about this like keeping a research log. You have to note what you're doing. In the class that I taught earlier, I mentioned that I have over 60,000 matches on Ancestry. There is no way I'm keeping information about 60,000 matches in my head, just like there is no way I am keeping track of every single search I've ever done in a record collection in my head. I have to keep it written down. I have to find a way to record it in some format. So before we get started, one of the big things is that you need to know your own tree. If you don't know your tree, it's hard to spot the common ancestor in somebody else's tree. Now, there are situations, obviously, where you might not know your tree, or you might not know part of your tree. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. That's when we create your clusters, you isolate your matches on the unknown parts, and then we'll talk about finding the most recent common ancestor in a match cluster, especially an unknown match cluster, in a minute. So make sure that you know your own tree. And if you're wondering, no, this is not my tree, I made this up for the class. Okay, as you work to identify relationships, think about the different DNA companies and what they offer. Because in reality, it is easier to do this process if you work with a company who has integrated trees on their site. Now, Ancestry definitely has good trees, good people build trees with records. MyHeritage does as well. Family Tree DNA does allow you to build trees, but they don't have any record integration at all, and so it's just less common for people to have put a tree onto Family Tree DNA. And 23andMe has tried various ways of building trees, but they really haven't found a good solid solution for that. So, you might want to start with the sites, if you're going to follow this process, start with the sites that actually have that better integration with their trees. Because really figuring out the common ancestor relies on the tree of the match. If there's no trees, then you get to contact your matches, which is definitely doable. But we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Now I kind of categorize the types of trees that you'll run into. There are some that I call full trees, and full trees are where there's enough people that you can spot the common ancestor pretty easily, or there's enough people for you to conclude that somehow there's not a common ancestor. Again, we'll talk about that one in a minute as well. There are people who have what I call small trees. A small tree has enough information, a name and a date and a place, that you can do something with it. We also have people, this is much more common on Ancestry, who have unlinked trees. We'll talk about those. people who have no trees, and people who have private trees. So the way you approach this idea of identifying the relationship does kind of vary depending on the tree of your match and what that tree looks like. So with full trees, then usually the match, they've either created or uploaded a pretty complete tree. And complete just means, you know, it goes back several generations and it has enough information that you can spot the common ancestor without too much difficulty. So you just review their tree and find the common ancestor. Say, oh, I recognize them because I know they're in my tree. Again, you need to know your own tree. So that's one of your first steps, is to make sure you've built out your tree for 5 to 7 generations so that you can spot your ancestors in other people's trees. So here's an example. Here is a match from MyHeritage. This match, probably based on the age, is about a generation older. Based on the amount of shared centimorgans, again, we're doing some evaluation here. We possibly think it's a second cousin once removed. We think based on the locations that it's along, you know, this particular line. If you had done some clusters, you could kind of figure that out as well. But the locations, for me personally and my family, the locations tell me usually which of my 4 lines they are, just because they're kind of in a very distinct. So I go ahead and I pull up, and here's the tree of the match. And I just went ahead and did put in names, because this is, I just changed all the names, so it's not actually the names of this particular match. But and I focused on the line where I saw the common ancestor was a couple named Jacob and Clara. So that's a couple that appears in my tree as well as in the tree of this DNA match. So I've identified the common ancestor, but the next step is to figure out how I'm related. And one of my favorite things to do is to build out descendancies. So if we share 90 centimorgans, I'm actually going to draw it out in a little bit of a descendancy chart so that I can see what the relationship is. I'm sure there are people out there that can kind of figure this out in their head, but I'm the kind of person who needs it visually right there in front of me. This is the relationship. So we say, okay, this is how we're both related to Jacob and Clara. We're full cousins, so that means we are, it looks like, 3rd cousins. So that's my conclusion, that this match number 10, and I are 3rd cousins. And then I need to somehow record that conclusion. In this case, I'm just using the notes feature on MyHeritage. Top right corner, there's a little notes button, and I just put in that the MRCA is Jacob and Clara. I put in Smith Jones, and then I like to write out the descendancy in my little notes. But you can put anything you want, or you can say, oh, I met them at this conference, or however you know them. But just, again, starting to capture that. Don't just leave it all in your head, put it somewhere else. Okay, so that's full trees. Those are pretty easy because, hey, there's the common ancestor. It's right there. So next up, let's talk a little bit about what we call I call small trees or baby trees. Small trees are trees where people have actually started putting information out there, but they haven't put out enough on their own tree for you to find the common ancestor. However, they have put out enough information for you to go and figure it out. So I always say that the tree has to have at least 1 deceased person with dates and places in order to do this. And now it could have 1 deceased person with a really uncommon name, or 2 deceased people with uncommon names, and sometimes you can find those people in other places. But if it doesn't have at least that much information, it's going to be a little bit hard to try and fill in the gaps, because the solution in this case is that you get to in a way, you get to build their tree for them. And that might be as easy as going out and searching an online tree and finding, oh, there's the person they put in their tree. I found them in this online tree over here, and I filled in the gaps. Or it might be a lot more difficult, where it's nobody else has done the research, and I am going to go start a tree on Ancestry and build out their ancestors for them and figure out the relationship. And again, whether or not you choose to do this comes back to this question: is this match somebody that's very important for your research project or not? Because if you're just kind of exploring your matches and having fun, you know, you might be willing to go out and search trees, but actually building out their tree for them on a whim, it might not be the highest priority. However, if this match, if you know this match has something to do with this unknown cluster that you're working, and you know that there might be the key to solving who the parents of your second great grandmother were, you probably are going to put the time into actually doing the research and building out the tree for the match. So once you have, built out some information, you kind of merge it into what they provided and what you've done, and then you figure out the relationship. So let's take a look at here's an example of that. So here we have a DNA match. This one's from Ancestry. This is for the match's name is Miller L. Second to third cousin, about 203 centimorgans. They do have a public link tree. Look at that in a second. But first, notice that the username actually has the surname Miller in the middle of it. Now, this isn't a real one, but I've seen this many times where I'm like, yeah, that the surname that I know in my tree on this line seems to be part of their username. So I'm thinking it's connected there. It might not be, but it's a clue. And then I want to look again at the tree to kind of guess the generation. Are we in the same generation? So if we're in about the same generation, I'm guessing maybe we're possibly second cousins because we share 203 centimorgans. I use the shared centimorgan project to kind of figure that out. So based on everything, the highest probability is second cousins because we're in the same generation. The other thing I look at, those clusters are suggesting that this is on my paternal grandmother's line. So that's the line that I want to focus on and see if this works out like I think it does. So again, just that brief evaluation kind of gives me an idea of what I'm looking at as I pull up the tree and as I work through the tree. So I went ahead and you'll notice there was a public link tree and there are 5 people. So here's the tree with everything's anonymized, but this is about what it looked like. So we had the match and the tree shows the father is private, the grandfather is private, the mother is Barbara, and the grandmother is Alice. Now, that's probably not enough to figure out where we connect. I don't know who Alice is. I don't know who Barbara is. So what do I do next? Well, at this point, you have a couple of options. The first one, and this is one of the ones that I find is the first thing I do is go out and search online trees. So Ancestry public member trees are great. FamilySearch family tree is great. MyHeritage has public trees. There's other online trees out there, excuse me, that I can use to kind of see if I can fill in based on the information provided by the match. Can I fill in their tree based on somebody else's tree? And of course, you also want to verify everything with a few records if you do this. But, you always want to be evaluating trees anyway because people put incorrect information in their trees all the time. The other option is to build out the trees for them, actually do the research. We sometimes call these kinds of trees quick and dirty trees because they are a little bit more reliant on hints than I usually would do. I will follow a few more hints, and I'm not going to do really serious, good research where I keep a research log and everything because I'm just trying to fill out everything on all of their lines until I can spot the common ancestor, and then I can go back and prove that with better research. But otherwise, it's going to take too long. So I've talked to a lot of people, and we do refer to these again as quick and dirty trees. A lot of times we'll build these. You go to Ancestry, and I'll just create a brand new tree, and I'll set it as private and non-searchable, and then just start building things out kind of quickly, more quickly than I would do if I were working on my own line where I want to verify and validate everything. So in this case, I'm going to start with Alice because she's born a little bit earlier. I could do Barbara as well, but I probably will end up I might have to look at both because I don't know which line they're on. But because Alice had a date and a place, and she actually did have a full name, not just a first name, I went out and I searched on FamilySearch family tree. And I do tend to start with FamilySearch family tree because of really one big thing, which is if I can find that person on FamilySearch family tree, FamilySearch family tree has this great little button that says, view my relationship. which is going to help me see how I'm related to Alice. So just kind of a great, because it's a big one world tree, they can do that on the FamilySearch family tree, that because ancestry trees are separate, that they can't do, which is both have strengths and weaknesses and stuff like that. But I do love that view my relationship button. So I went out and I found Alice on FamilySearch family tree, and I clicked view my relationship, and it actually said that I was related through Alice's spouse, John Miller. Now remember, the match had not listed the spouse's name. The match had only listed the spouse's private. So it turns out John Miller had also died. I think they just had failed to mark him as deceased in their tree. And, you know, the small trees are people who had a little bit of interest, got on, started, took a DNA test, and then probably haven't re-logged on, come back at all for years. So you kind of get what you get, and you work with them the way you can. But when I clicked that view my relationship button, it actually said that I was related to Alice. I'm actually not related to Alice. I'm related through the Miller line. And like I said, I'd recognized the Miller name in the username. So that was kind of a big clue as well. But I said, you know, Martin Miller and his wife Florence. So those are the common ancestors, except for then I realized as I looked at it that there's actually 2 sets of common ancestors, because the Miller and Hawk children, 3 Millers married 3 Hawks. So, and I'm descended from one line and these are from another line. So there is a second relationship in there. And that's okay. If you can show both relationships, you know, that are very clear, you can record that in your notes. So I come back into my main tree, and I'm gonna into the tree that the match provided, and I'm just gonna add in that information that I got from FamilySearch family tree, and now I can determine my relationship. So there's the common ancestors, the Millers, and the Hawks. So, you know, kind of going back, I shared 203 centimorgans. I guessed that was a second cousin. So I build out that descendancy. However, do you remember 203 was about right for a second cousin? So why is it so high? It's still within the second cousin range, but it's a little bit on the high side. And that's actually because there's that second relationship, because I'm actually third cousins twice. I'm third cousins through Martin and Florence, and then I'm third cousins again through Daniel and Grace. So there's just a second relationship. And all I need to do is acknowledge that both relationships exist. So in my little notes, I actually list out both most recent common ancestors. If I can identify more than one, I'm going to list them there. And that kind of explains why the 203 is a little bit higher, is because of the double cousin relationship. Okay, so another kind of tree that you might run into are unlinked trees. This is a situation where the match or the person managing the kit, the manager, has created an online tree, but they've not yet linked the DNA test to the person in the tree. They haven't told the system that this DNA test belongs to this person. The one thing to note is you start to evaluate these unlinked trees, and sometimes you'll come in and it'll say they have 5 unlinked trees that are public and 2 that are private, and you get to look at all of them. But the problem is the home person in that tree, it could be the person who's managing the kit, because obviously it's their account and they're managing this other kit. It could be the spouse of the person who took the DNA test. That's why I kind of suggested saying if you're a match to the to the manager of the kit. It could be a parent, a grandparent, a child, or it could just be some, you know, second or third cousin, like I said, who got this person to take a DNA test. So unlinked trees can sometimes be helpful, and sometimes none of them have anything to help you at all. So you just kind of have to move on if that's the case. But sometimes you can also get a little creative, and this is the case with anything. I just wanted to show you one where I actually had to take a few extra steps to figure out the common ancestor. So here's a match. Again, we've kind of anonymized the data, but the match's initials were TC, and it was managed by a T. Collymore. It was managed by somebody else, but the surname is kind of unusual. The one thing to note is that the little icon on the side suggests that this person is male, and that possibly TC the surname is Collymore. And then based on the clusters over on the side, this is suggesting it's a maternal grandfather's line. Now, TC had a public tree that is unlinked to anything, and it's called the Williams family tree. So not the Collymore family tree, but the Williams tree. So we take a look at that, and this is what I found. is that the main person on this tree is a female with the same person listed as both the father and the mother. So somebody again who came in who didn't have a lot of experience and maybe not a lot of interest engaging with ancestry took a DNA test and provided this information. So at this point, you might say it's not worth my time to try and figure this out, but I love the hunt. I love searching for things. So I wanted to see if I could solve it. So I took John Williams and I went out to the FamilySearch family tree, and I found out that John Williams had married Pearl Davis, and here are all their ancestors. And however, the more I looked at it, I realized there was nothing common between the Williams Pearls, the Williams Davis lines and my lines. So I thought, okay, well, what else could I do? Now, this doesn't always work, but again, you can go out and look at things on living people. One of my favorite resources are obituaries. Now, John had died long enough ago that he had kind of died when his children were about 1 or 2, and I didn't know that his obituary would help much. But Pearl didn't die until 2005. So I went out and I found, because what I'm thinking now is that maybe, if you remember, the match themselves were had the icon as if it was a male, and yet the tree is for a female. So I'm actually wondering if this tree was actually for the tester's spouse. Just as a thought, might not be true, but something to explore. So again, I said, like I said, so I thought, okay, obituaries, maybe Pearl's obituary would name her daughters and her daughters' husbands. So I went out and I found an obituary for Pearl. It says that she survived by a son, Richard, and then a daughter named Cindy, who married Thomas Collymore. And if you'll remember, the match's name was TC, who was managed by a T. Collymore. So, and again, this is all, it's a real case, but everything's been anonymized. So these aren't their real names. However, that gave me the clue that maybe what I was right, that the match who was female was really the spouse of the person who took the test, and that maybe that TC what stood for Thomas Collymore. So I kind of proposed that it was Thomas Collymore, born about the 1960s, somewhere in Utah. And then Collymore is such an unusual name. I just went out and searched for a Collymore at all from Utah who would have been married before the 1960s, and I ran into Harold. And Harold listed in his obituary that he was survived by a son named Thomas and his wife Cindy. So again, this makes me think that Harold is that I'm on the right track for figuring out this match. And then he married Shirley Harris, and I realized that Harris was one of my family names. And that made me think that I was really on the right track. So I kind of built out Thomas's tree a little bit based on that information. And it turns out that, lo and behold, if I build out the Harris line, not the Collymore line, there's the common ancestor, that I'm related to Anthony and Virginia. So from there, I can figure out, I can actually figure out what the relationship is. So we share 271 centimorgans. This is how we would be related. And the shared centimorgan chart supports the relationship as second cousins. That looks right. So sometimes if, again, you have to think, are these matches that I really need to spend time solving, that I need to build out their trees on? Well, then you might have to play a little bit of the detective and see if you can figure out. Now, if it's just for fun, you might say, yeah, I'm moving on because that's clearly not right. And I don't really have the interest or the need to explore this match further. And then again, I'm going to make my notes, put in a note, and hopefully not misspell the name Stanley. Okay, now what do you do if the match has no tree? And I hear a lot of, people get a little bit of frustration with these people. Why did they take a DNA test and they don't have a tree? What's wrong? But you need to stop and kind of think about why people take DNA tests. And a lot of it is not because they were hoping to connect with their matches. It's because they wanted to see their ethnicities. So let's say your match does not have a tree, or they have a private tree, meaning they've not set up public, you can't see it. Or maybe they have a public tree, but the public tree has 3 people in it and all of their names are private. or they give you the name of John Smith as the father, but nothing else. And so you can't really do it much about exploring it. So in this case, you have some options. One is you can use the shared matches and, as you're creating your clusters, and you can just guess and say, I think this person probably belongs on great grandpa's line. And that's not a line I care about. So I probably am not going to do much more than that. I'm just going to make a note that the common ancestor is probably here in this, based on the amount of shared DNA, I'm guessing these are the common ancestors, and I'm not going to worry about it from here. However, again, if you go back to your research goal, this is a line that's really important and I really need to know it. You might want to contact your matches. But be careful about how many matches you contact and really think about what you're going to say. Like I said, think about your goal and just focus on contacting the people who actually relate to your research goal. And those are the ones where you're going to make more effort to contact. But as you reach out, be polite, but be clear. This is why you're contacting and this is what you're hoping for. Keep it short, keep it simple, be specific. I'm trying to figure out some DNA connections and I think we're related, and could you help me out by providing the names of your deceased great grandparents or something like that? Or I think we're related on this line. As one of your parents got this surname or something like that. If you're reaching out to somebody who manages multiple kits, or when there's a manager, make sure you reference which kit or which test. Now I'm matched with the test for TC managed by T. Collymore. It's possible that person manages multiple tests or multiple kits. And if you just say I match you with nothing more, it can be a little bit confusing as to who you're matching and exactly what you're hoping for. Keep in mind that some people know nothing about their ancestors, but also think about what you hope to get out of the contact and then offer to share what you've learned. Okay, so then kind of a couple other situations. What if there's no match at all? Match has a full or small tree. You cannot identify a common ancestor. Look for common surnames, common locations. But remember that this might be evidence of a non-paternal event or a misattributed parental event, which is about the same thing. Just it could be in your tree, it could be in your matches tree. If you want to figure out, is that in my tree, make sure, are you matching all the other ancestors? Look at your shared matches. Does everything seem to be right? But if you conclude that the problem, that there is some NP or NPA probably in your matches tree, one of the big things is don't reach out and say, I think there's a problem with your tree and you're probably adopted. Wait for them to contact you. If they've got questions, they'll contact you. Otherwise, just move on and just skip that match. Because it's possible that you don't know that. And if they're not if they're not ready to discuss that or deal with that, you don't want to kind of put it, it's not your place to tell them that there's something going on. How about if a known cousin doesn't match? Once in a while, you have a known cousin, a second cousin, you've taken a DNA test and you both tested with the same company and you're not listed as a match. What does that mean? Well, remember that only if you're kind of more distant cousins, you're only guaranteed to share DNA with a second cousin or closer. So you're going to want to start testing more people, more of your family, more of their family, and see if there are some connections. It just happens to be that the two of you happen to be the ones who don't match. However, if nobody matches, then again, you're probably looking at an NPE or an MPE, so you have to review your shared matches and kind of figure out what's going on. Kind of just a quick note, we do have some DNA companies that automate finding the common ancestor. Corey talked about these earlier today with the through lines, the theory of family relativity. You just want to be careful. These are built off of trees and they're built off of other people's trees. And they're just kind of, if one person puts that ancestor there that you think is breaking a brick wall, it could just be that the system's even deciding these three people are siblings and they're not. So it's the system, Ancestry's, got some algorithms doing all this. MyHeritage does this with the theory of family relativity too, but you have to evaluate it. Don't take it at its word, because it could be that there's some errors in that through lines. And then there is a kind of a fun tool if you do have a 23andMe account that's called, they just call it the family tree, but it's an attempt. It's more based on DNA and shared matches to try and place your matches in a kind of an ancestry descendancy combination tree. It's a kind of a fun thing to play around with. If you haven't taken a look at that, you might want to. But they are relying a lot more, I think, on DNA because they don't have trees from people that are based on records. It's more about the shared matches and the amount of DNA as they try and figure that out. Okay, the last thing we just want to go through is this idea of having an unknown cluster. What do you do with an unknown cluster? So you know these people, you've clustered them, you know that they are connected to you, but you don't know how. And in this situation, what you have to do is take yourself out of the equation. You don't know how you're related to them, so what you're going to do is start by looking at how they're related to each other. So there are two kind of big steps with working with these unknown clusters. The first one is you kind of explore the cluster, take each of the people in the cluster, look at their trees and see if you can find an ancestor or ancestors that appear in multiple trees in the people in the cluster. And if that's the case, so you're going to start, you've got that unknown cluster. This is hopefully on your research goal. Explore those trees, identify the common ancestors. If there's no common ancestors, see if you can figure out common locations and surnames, build out their trees, do those quick and dirty trees, search online trees, do whatever you can to kind of see if you can connect all of the people in the cluster to each other. So again, you're taking yourself out and you're just looking at the people in the cluster. The second step then was once you've actually said, oh, there they are, there's a common ancestor, you need to figure out how you're related to that cluster, probably through that common ancestor. So you usually start with that ancestor and then you identify their descendants. Once in a while, you have to go back a generation or two and identify additional descendants. And what you're going to do is you compare names, ages, places where the descendants settled based on what you know of the ancestor you're researching, so you can figure out where they fit in to that cluster. So again, you're going to evaluate the shared centimorgans, kind of consider the relationships between you or the person you're helping and that unknown cluster. What are the possible relationships? And then we're going to take a look at the what are the odds tool as well as a great resource for this that has some, and again, this is from DNA Painter. Johnny Pearl talked about it during our special event at lunch. So then if you have multiple clusters, you can repeat the process for the other clusters and then see if you can find how descendants from one cluster might have married descendants from the other cluster, which also can help narrow things down as well. So let's kind of see how this works. For those of you who were at the class this morning on clustering, we introduced Emily. Emily wants to find her biological father. So we have a bunch of known information about Emily. She's born 1971 in Arizona. Her mother gave 3 different names for her father. And we know that Emily's mother is probably living in California when she was conceived. So again, we've got this probably California, the 1968 to 70 time period. And we know that Kathy is born around 1947. So just some information about Kathy kind of can give us a sense of maybe what we're looking for the father as well. Okay, so remember we created 2 paternal matches for Emily. And we're going to start with paternal cluster number 2. And why are we going to start with paternal cluster number 2? Well, because the top match that actually has a tree is in the cluster number 2. So we're going to start with Ronald. Now in this situation, earlier we were looking at trees and saying, okay, we need to find the common ancestor based on my tree, but now I need to compare the trees of the people in the cluster. So we start with Ronald and we look at his tree. So here's his tree. And I like to just pull out a piece of paper and write down the surnames in his tree, just to start keeping track of it, because Ronald actually has a fairly decent, what we'd almost call a full tree, because he's got a lot of people and names and dates and places and things like that. Okay, and then we're going to go back to the cluster and pick the next person in the cluster who has a tree. You have to look for somebody who has a tree, and then you look at her tree. So this is Sharon's tree, and here's the surnames from Ronald's tree. You start seeing something familiar between the 2 trees? Well, I noticed that both trees have this Turner Ward family in them. Now, again, this is fictionalized, so of course it's very easy to make it work. Sometimes you have to explore multiple trees and compare all sorts of surnames, but this one is set up to be a little bit easier. So we look at Sharon's tree. There she's got the common ancestors, Moses and Agnes. And looking back at Ronald's tree, he also has Moses Turner and Agnes Ward. Yay, we found a common ancestor between Ronald and Sharon's trees. But we also have a lot bigger cluster. Let's see if anybody else also has Ronald or has the Turner Ward connection. So we say, okay, the MRCA we're guessing is Moses and Agnes for Ronald and Sharon. We take a look at Tiffany. She also has Moses and Agnes. Then we get to Randy. Now, what's making me pause about Randy? He's in the paternal cluster number 2. Well, unfortunately, he doesn't have a tree. So we have to skip Randy. We go down to Ryan. He also has Moses and Agnes Turner. And then Nancy down here is not related to Moses and Agnes Turner, but they're related to Agnes's parents. Nancy's a descendant of Henry and Betsy Ward, who are Agnes's parents. So it is still a connection to the same tree. It's just a generation back. Okay, so then we're going to take the cluster and we're going to actually figure out how are all these people related to each other. Just kind of a visual element. You'll notice I'm very visual and I love to see the descendancies. I feel like it's a great way to kind of verify that I know what I'm looking at. So there's Moses married Agnes Turner, or Moses Turner married Agnes Ward. And they had at least 3 children. And then Agnes's parents, Agnes had a brother, Charles, and there's also a descendant, Nancy, who shares 27 centimorgans with Emily. So what does this suggest? Well, this suggests that Emily is probably tied into this family. And based on the fact that Emily is sharing 128 centimorgans with Sharon and 178 with Ronald, and then 101 and 93 with Ryan, makes me think that she's not a descendant of Hazel, Jesse, or Michael, because then she should share more with one of those children, that she's actually a descendant of another child. And then, of course, we don't think it's all the way back to Henry and Betsy because Nancy's only sharing 27 centimorgans, but it could be a different connection to the Wards. So something to kind of, Emily can now guess that she belongs to this family. And her next step really should be, well, before we do that, you can draw these descendancies like this, which I wanted to show you, or you can go play with the what are the odds tool. And the what are the odds tool lets me put in all of those known amounts of DNA, kind of just the same thing I was showing you. And then I can hypothesize where the person, the target person, who's Emily in this case, fits. So you put in hypotheses. It's a really fun tool to play with, but you'll want to go and explore it a little bit more. And this is available from DNA Painter. Okay, so what's Emily's next step? Well, she wants to identify the descendants of Moses and Agnes Ward Turner and see if she can figure out, family that might have moved to California because the Turners are from Massachusetts, or in addition to that, she might go back to paternal cluster number 1 and see if she can find a common ancestor in paternal cluster number 1. So and if she can do that, then she can compare and connect the descendants of both. So that's what she does. She goes back to paternal cluster number 1 and she discovers that there's a Samuel and Maggie Dupree Fuller who appears in several of her trees. And she had to go way down her list to get this. And they had a descendant, as she looks at all their descendants, they had a descendant named Pauline who married Jeremy, who was the grandson of Moses and Agnes Ward Turner. So what does this suggest? Well, if Emily is DNA matching to both Pauline's lines and Jeremy's lines, unless there's another marriage somewhere in there, cousins or siblings marrying siblings, she's guessing that she's a descendant of Jeremy and Pauline, which brings her much closer to herself. And then she can look, and Pauline and Jeremy might be her grandparents, and then she can look at their sons, and she might have to, compare dates and locations. Did any of them end up in California? And then from there, start contacting people and seeing if any of them will test for her to kind of make this final conclusion. Okay, so that's kind of a quick overview of what you do with an unknown cluster, but it's still that same core concept, which is that you try and explore the cluster, take yourself out of the equation, explore the cluster, find common ancestors, look at their descendants, and then kind of bring yourself back in and see if you can figure out how you fit into the descendants. And then if you've got multiple clusters and you connect the descendants and the clusters, that's even better. Okay, and a couple other tips before we end. Make sure that you're testing with multiple companies and working your matches with multiple companies. You might want to do wire mitochondrial DNA tests. I've mentioned this a couple times. Make sure you're tracking your matches, the relationships. You can use the note features on the websites or spreadsheets, whatever it takes. Make sure that you're keeping track of who these people are, put them in clusters, do anything you can to organize the thousands and thousands of DNA matches that you have. Also notice how valuable it is that other people will put a tree out there and make it public. So you consider doing the same, because you want your tree to be out there and you want it to be public so that it can help other people. Now, one of the things I've heard a couple of people say is, well, I have a lot of hypotheses in my tree. I don't want that shared too quickly because I'm still researching those families. And I totally understand that. My solution actually was to create a second version of my tree that just has my direct ancestors and a few, children, maybe one generation down. And I sourced the whole thing. I went back 7 generations. I set it as public, and I haven't touched it since. And that's what I attached my DNA to. And I attached my parents' DNA to it. So that means that if somebody else is, trying to figure out our relationship, they can use that tree, but it doesn't have any of my hypotheses or working theories. That's all in a public or a private working tree behind the scenes. So I just keep 2 trees. The one for the DNA and one for myself. Anyway, and make sure your DNA is connected to your tree as well. Again, unlinked trees make things more complicated. So, okay, just a reminder, we had those 2 key DNA processes. We talked about clustering or grouping your matches, and then we talked about determining relationships. Just as a reminder, the 2 things go hand in hand. They work together, that you find a relationship, then you cluster, and then you find a relationship, and then you cluster, and so forth. So they really are the 2 foundational processes as you try and solve your DNA, your research questions using DNA. Okay, so I believe our next class, somebody wants to jump in and help me remember, it starts at 2:15.
It does.
So what I'm going to suggest is, while Daniel gets set up, I'm happy to answer questions, but we might need to take a break. Brandon, do we need to take a break on the stream?
At least 3 minutes to 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes. So
okay, so we're going to have to take a break on the stream for a few minutes. I apologize if you're on YouTube or Facebook. You'll just have to jump over to the new thing. But Daniel, if you want to go ahead and start sharing for your class. I apologize. This is a new class that I developed for DNA Day this year, and I wasn't sure how long it would take to teach it. So I'll have to figure out how to teach it in better timing next time. So anyway, if we've got a few questions while Daniel gets set up, we can go ahead and do that and let Brandon switch over to the take a break between the 2 sessions.
Okay, sounds good. Irma on Zoom asked, how does the shared CM project tool compare to the possible DNA estimates at Ancestry when you click on the Ancestry DNA link below the initial estimated DNA relationship?
I have not done much with the estimated DNA relationships in a couple of years. So I'm not exactly sure how it relates. I'm not sure how Ancestry compiles that information. I'm not sure, though, that I think one of the things that I love about what Blaine has put together and what Johnny and the others have put together and are hosting on DNA Painter is that it's based off of real data. That he's actually going out and collecting real data, which is why I find there's more value there. I don't know that Ancestry is doing that. I haven't ever heard that they are. So I think they're doing more like probabilities and things like that, which is great. But I do love to see that, these are real examples of what's going on. And I know that Blaine's working always to update it. At some point recently, he was like, now, if anybody has a double relationship, would you let me know what the numbers are? And, he's trying to figure out how to add more things into it.
Linda from Facebook asks, my matches are not that close. Most are in the third cousin and beyond range. How can I figure out what side of the family they are on?
So I think you still have to look at their trees and evaluate their trees. Even if it's a third cousin, even if it's not a second cousin, anybody who has a tree is fair game, whether it's a small tree or an unlinked tree, because if you can figure out a couple of them, then you can start clustering, and then those clusters can help kind of suggest what's going on with the other matches that you have. So yeah, it might not be a third cousin that you figure out. It might be a fourth cousin or a third cousin once removed or something like that, or a third half cousin twice removed. But any relationship that you can figure out can get you started on clustering, which will help with the unknown matches. So yeah, anybody's got a tree, get in and start digging into their trees, which sounds a little bit stalkerish, but really just go in and see what they have, what their trees tell you about them.
Okay, Robin asks on Zoom, do you keep your quick and dirty trees after you've finished, or do you delete them? And also, well, go ahead and answer that, and then we've got some follow-up.
You could delete them once you've solved it. I tend to, if I'm working on one project, I merge all the quick and dirty trees into one tree, because eventually they should all connect to each other. So it's kind of one tree file with all of the quick and dirty trees connected. I know that in one situation I solved it, and then because the quick and dirty tree had turned out to have so much information into it, I ended up just sharing it with the person I was helping. And so I think she uses it now as her main tree, or at least uses a lot of it, because I've seen her add stuff to it. So, you could just delete them. It depends on, either that, or you might want to copy some of the data into your main tree if you figured things out, if it's for yourself. But yeah, you can delete them whatever you want. But like I said, I tend to put all of them in under a single tree file name, just with lots of different starting points.
Okay, and you do that on Ancestry, or do you use a different program?
Personally, I do use Ancestry for that. I've seen people use the FamilySearch family tree because, it's all public anyway, and they can pull in data from multiple different points, as long as it's kind of got those sources and stuff like that. But yeah, I do tend to use Ancestry. And if you are going to do quick and dirty trees, the big recommendation is usually to make sure that they're private and unsearchable. There's an option in there as to whether somebody can search it. That way nobody's ever confused as to why, nobody ever gets confused as to exactly why their family shows up in your tree, because you went down that path thinking there was a connection, but then it really wasn't the right family. And yeah, it's just easier not to make those public or anything like that.
Okay.